everyone. Welcome to the Clinton-Macomb Public Library program for the 100th anniversary of suffrage. I hope everyone can hear me, and if you wanted to throw in chat that you could hear me, it would allay a lot of my fears, but I'm going to assume that you can regardless. So we have with us today Professor Karen Miller. She is a professor of history at Oakland University, who will be telling us, thank you, Deborah. Deborah can hear us just fine. Who will be telling us and teaching us about the history of suffrage. And if you have any questions, we would ask you to put them into the chat. And unless it's something that is really warrants an interruption of Professor Miller, we will save those to the end and I will moderate them then. But feel free to put them in chat as we go along if that's what's easiest for you. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Professor Miller. Thank you so much for being with us today, and I can't wait to hear what you have to say.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and it's a delight to be here, even when we're not in close proximity. And I always enjoy these events with Clinton-Macomb Library. I think you've got a great set of programs going on, and I'm always impressed by what you're doing. And very happy to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, which gives women the national right to vote. And so basically what I'm going to be doing today is narrating a slide projection. So you will be not seeing my face in just a moment. I will sort of talk through what I would normally present if I were there in person. Okay, so what I'd like to do today, I was asked to do this back before COVID times, and I was given a very sort of open latitude in terms of what I would talk about. And so I thought about it for a long time. And really what I want to focus on is not so much just the typical narrative of how we get women's rights to suffrage, but more about the sort of larger context in the beginning of the 20th century and how women getting the right to vote fits into a much larger dynamic concerning this kind of fundamental quality of American citizenship. And this is an issue that American historians have really been looking at in great depth for the last 10 years or so, because what we're discovering is that there is, in fact, a very vibrant and sometimes acrimonious debate about who gets to claim full citizenship and who does not. And so that's what I want to talk about today. Whoa. Okay, different button. We have people, gaining the right to vote in the early 20th century, but it's also important to remember simultaneously, people are losing the right to vote. And there are two particular groups of people that I wanted to mention, and those are immigrants and African Americans. In the 19th century, immigrants came into the United States relatively unhindered. There were a few small groups that were being stopped from entry. Most of that was based on either nationality or health. And so Chinese were the first group to be banned. And also we do see some interruptions of people because they're carrying specific diseases are not allowed into the country. But as a result of that, you see a growing wave of immigration coming in after the Civil War, and particularly at the beginning of the 20th century. And this has everything to do with the kind of attraction of the American economy, the fact that it is possible to come to the United States and relatively quickly enter the labor force and start a new life, and starting a new life that in fact had very few limitations in a lot of respects. But this rising number of immigrants into the United States caused concern for a variety of reasons that In the turn of the century, immigrants are often associated with violent European political movements like anarchism or socialism. And the fear is that by allowing immigrants to come into the country really unfiltered, you will see radical ideology coming into the United States. That there's also a deep suspicion of whether or not immigrants can or are willing to fit in. Increasingly, immigrants coming into the United States are of unusual religions like Catholicism. There wasn't a large Catholic population in the United States before really the 1880s, 1890s, but we see significant immigration of Catholics coming into the country. And all kinds of suspicions that they really are not capable of being real Americans because their primary allegiance is to the Pope. We also see large numbers of Jewish people coming into the United States, but also Eastern Rite Orthodox people coming in from parts of Russia, from southeastern Europe, who follow basically the old Byzantine rites of Greek Orthodoxy. And they're also seen as populations that don't really fit in. They speak very different languages that are very unlike English. In many cases, even when they are literate, they're not literate in the Roman alphabet because they've learned to read and write in Cyrillic or Hebrew or other languages like that. And so the fear is that these immigrants really just can't assimilate. And so they're going to be this sort of group of potentially dangerous and un-Americans living in America. That also, we see a lot of identification, particularly in American cities, of immigrants being the fuel that strengthens the political machines of American cities. So Tammany Hall in New York City, which is the one that's most widely known, really serves the immigrant community, but also stays in power largely because immigrants vote for them and the children of immigrants vote for them. And so at the beginning of the 20th century, there's actually a broad movement in the United States to curtail immigration and also to curtail the capacity of these immigrants to become American citizens and participate in the electoral system. In a parallel way, we see the same kind of impact with African Americans, predominantly in the Deep South, who are claiming citizenship because of the 14th Amendment and are beginning to participate politically because of the 15th Amendment. And that begins disrupting the power structure of the South. That we have to remember that the culture of slavery presumed the intellectual and social inferiority of Africans, and therefore they had to be enslaved to be protected, or to be protected from themselves, but also to protect the rest of society from them. And so when you end slavery, many people, many white people in the South believe that other things have to be put in place to prevent former slaves and their children from becoming full citizens. So that's how you protect Southern society. And so there is an enormous push in the South after the 1880s to protect elite white privilege by disenfranchising African Americans, by limiting their rights to own property, by limiting their rights to serve on juries, to bring cases to court, that sort of thing. Also, I will point out, in parallel to the immigrants, they are associated with corrupt politics in the South, that they are seen as selling their votes, though instead of two corrupt urban political machines, it's the corrupt Republican Party in the South. Most of the Republicans who are registered voters in the South are members of the Republican Party because they see the Democratic Party as being the standard bearer of segregation and white supremacy. And so we have this sort of larger movement in the United States that is driven largely by the white elites, the white middle class, to limit these two particular groups. There are others as well, but these are the two major ones. And we see things like for the immigrants, the process of naturalization changes in 1906, that it used to be really controlled by state judges. And so if you became a citizen in the state of Massachusetts, you became an American citizen. And that meant that politicians in the states really controlled the process of citizenship. We see that shifting over to the national level with the standardization of, how long do you have to wait until citizenship? What do you have to know to be a citizen, et cetera, et cetera. In some cases, this helps in some states where they had been trying to keep citizens out, keep immigrants out. Citizenship qualifications were very difficult. But in states like New York, where they were very liberal, this actually tightens up the process of citizenship. And so we see that kind of movement going on. That also increasingly states will increase the residency rights for voting. And so how long do you have to be a resident of the state before you can register to vote? How long do you have to be at that particular address before you can register to vote? How long have you had to pay property taxes before you can register to vote? Those kinds of impediments are being put into state legal systems at the beginning of the 20th century, and they're really designed to block poor immigrants from becoming full citizens. And also in the South, they're primarily used against African Americans to prevent them from being allowed to vote. Then increasingly, we see the implementation of literacy tests. They are most widespread in the South, but they're actually also being implemented in the North for the same kinds of reasons. They're about filtering out people who we don't want to be able to vote and participate fully in American democracy. And increasingly, we see the use of poll taxes, which are supposed to be about revenue enhancement for states, but in fact are really about preventing poor people from being able to register to vote. And so we have to understand that as we are seeing this massive expansion of women's right to vote in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, we are simultaneously seeing a contraction of other groups being allowed to vote. And it's really that tension that I want to talk about today. This is where we are pretty much at the end of the first decade of the 20th century, that in terms of women's suffrage, suffrage in the United States is mostly controlled by the state governments. They're the ones who determine mostly the time and manner of elections. They're the ones who determine who's eligible to vote. They run the process of actual elections. And the kind of constitutional mandates for elections are really only they're a very important piece, but they're a very small piece of this whole process. Where we do have some women's suffrage is, as you can see, in the Western states. And the first that are before the 20th century are those Rocky Mountain states, with Wyoming being first, and Utah, Idaho, and Colorado following shortly thereafter. That with this movement, we have to remember that all of these states are implementing women's suffrage not so much because they believe that it's a political right or it will improve American democracy, but they see this as part of their sort of internal political problems. In particular in Wyoming and Colorado, the push is to give women the right to vote to encourage more women to move to those 2 states because there's a clear demographic displacement with too many men and not enough women. So they figure if we give women the franchise, that would not really disrupt our states, but will encourage women to move here. In Idaho and Utah, it's a little bit different because in both of these states, that is a factor, but it's also a political a goal for the Mormon Church to get women the right to vote because Mormons are disproportionately female. And so the Mormon Church is very strongly behind the idea of women's suffrage because they think it will give their church more power in these two states. And so these are all really, these are characteristics of voting that really don't apply very many places in the United States. This is really kind of unique. And so the template that is first set by Wyoming is not one that's easily applied other places. But women advocates of suffrage realize that it's easier to get Western states to give women the right to vote than it is to get Eastern states, because first and foremost, these are younger states, so they tend not to have really deeply entrenched political machines, so there's not a lot of weight that is concerned about disrupting the electorate. That also, these are states that are not terribly deeply populated. And so the ability to sort of create political factions is very different. And so the opponents of women's suffrage have more difficulty sort of, coalescing against the movement. But in each of these cases before 1912, women are given the right to vote under fairly unique state circumstances. That why women get the right to vote in California is very different than why women get the right to vote in Montana. And so each of these is really unique and not terribly applicable to the country as a whole. That also, these are all states that are not very populated at this time. California is still really a frontier state. And so we're really talking about a small percentage of women in the United States being eligible to vote. But the large women's suffrage organizations in the United States, in basically from 1900 on, see these as sort of testing grounds for ideas about recruitment of women's suffrage. And so these are going to be the beta tests for the big national campaigns and for the big campaigns in the eastern seaboard states where there's really going to be a big fight over whether or not to give women the right to vote. So we have to remember that, on the eve of, however we want to describe this, as on the eve of World War I, on the eve of the Woodrow Wilson administration, on the eve of the really modern women's suffrage movement, we're still very in a very tenuous situation. That the notion of how we're going to move forward is still in a testing phase. And so we start seeing then national organizations beginning to look at this data and figuring out what should be the next step. Now, the women who are going to dominate this campaign are these two ladies, Carrie Chapman Catt and Ruth Hannah McCormick. Carrie Chapman Catt had been the leader, the second president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, which is the biggest national organization. She was the first president of the association after Susan B. Anthony. And she does resign from the presidency for a brief period of time to deal with family matters, but really will be the architect of this larger national strategy. That Catt believes that the most pragmatic thing is to continue working on this state-by-state strategy. And so she assumes that the NAWSA will continue to make ground in states like Minnesota and Illinois and Iowa and so on and so forth. That the idea is that there'll be this move through the plains into the kind of trans-Appalachian East and then eventually into the East Coast. So she's very much supportive of this idea of state organizations pushing on their own and getting assistance from experts at NAWSA about recruitment and how to run these campaigns and how to think about the strategy of political development for women's rights. But simultaneously, what we see beginning in really 1912 and then continuing through 1914 will be this idea of also simultaneously operating on a national strategy that will get a constitutional amendment. And as I mentioned at the beginning, largely states control the actual process of citizenship and of elections. But the federal government does have certain rights. They set the November election in the Constitution, but also we can have amendments to the Constitution, like the 14th Amendment, that will grant citizenship to certain previously disqualified people. And so she agrees that ultimately we need a national suffrage amendment that will guarantee women the right to vote. And she sees this largely in the terms of pragmatism, because she does believe that certain states will never give the right to vote under any circumstances. Predominantly in the South, that the entrenched power of white men, white upper and middle class men in the South is so solid and so unwilling to share power that they will never give women the right to vote for fear of having their power curtailed. And there are also some northern states like Rhode Island that show deep signs of intransigent resistance to the idea of women's suffrage at the beginning of the 1910s. And she thinks that the only way that women living in those states will get the right to vote is if there's a national amendment. And so she will work very hard in terms of creating this sort of new path of citizenship for women whose state governments otherwise would not give it to them. That her primary assistant in this is going to be Ruth Hanna McCormick. Ruth Hanna McCormick will become the chief lobbyist for NASA on Capitol Hill. She is a particularly wonderful choice. NASA had never had a specific person who was designed to do lobbying on Capitol Hill before. And she, as the first candidate, is going to be a very important selection. Ruth Hanna McCormick is the wife of a member of the United States Senate. She is from Illinois. She is married to Medill McCormick. He is considered to be one of the great rising stars of Congress, and is seen as this, and when he's a first-term senator, they talk about how he's eventually going to become president of the United States. And so she is very well positioned in terms of being connected to a kind of entry into Capitol Hill through her husband. But probably more importantly, Ruth Hanna McCormick is the daughter of probably one of the greatest strategists of American political history, Mark Hanna. Mark Hanna had been a member of the Senate in the late 19th century. He was also the person who constructed the successful Republican response to industrialization at the turn of the century. He was generally regarded as the most astute politician in terms of strategic thinking that the United States has ever seen. When Ruth was a young girl, when she was in high school, she went to a boarding school and she hated it and thought it was boring and stupid. And so, once on holiday, she announced at the dinner table that she wasn't going to go back. And to her mother's enormous shock, her father said, well, okay, if you don't want to go and do something stupid, that's fine. You don't have to go to high school anymore. And but then he followed that up very quickly, saying, but you're not going to sit in your room and read novels and eat candy all day. You're going to work for me. And so at the age of 15, she became his correspondence secretary. And so eventually, by the time she would have gone to college, she was already managing his schedule for the day. She was planning all of his meetings. She was arranging dinner parties that were really kind of about, politicking. She is a person who develops in her own right extraordinarily skillful abilities at manipulating the political system of the United States, and probably is all but equal to her father. And so she uses that kind of entry through her husband to Capitol Hill, but also uses all the knowledge that she learned from her father to then dedicate herself to getting what will become the 19th Amendment passed through Congress, but also ratified by enough states to become law. Now, these two women and others, they're not alone in this effort, but at the national level, we do see extraordinary skill in terms of understanding political terrain and then exercising a strategy that will be successful. And so we have to appreciate the power of elite women in terms of bringing the 19th Amendment into law. But also, there's an important shift that occurs right about this time, right between about 1910 and 1914, that will really bring to bear success. It's not simply this acumen of understanding the political process in Congress, but it's also about understanding the politics of coalition. And this really comes back more to Carrie Chapman Catt, who's a more strong advocate of this idea. Up until 1910 or so, the suffrage movement had really been a movement of white middle class and upper class women that was about giving them power because it was unfair that stupid poor men could vote when they couldn't. And so there's a very clear classism to the voting process that we see coming out of the kind of old school suffragist movement. And that was argued as one of the sort of primary failings of the suffrage movement in the East Coast in particular, that it wasn't enough. There weren't enough middle class, well-educated white women to form a significant political body. And so what we start seeing is the development of coalitions, political coalitions under NASA and sponsored by NASA that will help ultimately to bring to bear a transformation of American politics. And that's really what I want to spend the next several minutes talking about. The first big step is going to be completely independent of the suffrage movement. It's actually a labor organization that's generally referred to as the Uprising of the 20,000. This was an effort by women who were involved in the needle trade. So they worked in garment factories. They made blouses and pants and stuff like that. That they were very poorly paid. They were regularly fired, that basically if a garment factory didn't have orders to deliver to some store, then everybody would come into work in the morning and be told to go home and just keep coming back every day and see if we get any new orders. And so it's very difficult to earn a living working in the garment industry, particularly if you're a woman, because they're all at the bottom ranks of the hierarchy. So they're the ones who are first fired and often the last ones to come on to the job when a new contract is signed for delivery. And so these women are increasingly frustrated by the situation in the garment industry. They're frustrated by other things beyond wages. They're very deeply concerned about health and safety. Working in a garment factory is very dangerous. There's all kinds of lung disease. We know about black lung, I think, in the coal mining industry. There's this thing called white lung in the garment industry from breathing all of this dust from fabric and thread and so on and so forth all day long. That there are all kinds of problems of predatory behavior by owners of plants, but also of foremen. And so women often don't feel safe at work, that they feel that their livelihood is up to the caprice of a foreman who may or may not want to sleep with them, that they're frustrated. And so they begin to organize themselves in 1909 and then create a mass strike in New York City, which is the center of the garment industry in the United States. And 20,000 women go out on strike, targeting the largest of the garment factories. And their goal is to shut down the industry until they get some of their demands. Their first demand is going to be for higher wages. That's the one that the companies are most likely to give them, but also they will call for better safety conditions, fire escapes, that sort of thing. And we do see after about a half a year strike, they will come back to work as the manufacturers will actually agree to their demands. During this period, what we see is an intense mobilization of women. Women suddenly believe that they can actually sort of control their destiny, that they can withhold their wages and actually get what they want. That we also see the emergence of charismatic leaders within the women's movement, people like Clara Lemlich, who is a tireless union organizer and is very interested in holding up the picket line. She's arrested several times. She makes major, beautiful speeches that are designed to sort of rouse public opinion. And so we see this growing sense of ability to sort of change your life among working class women, but also we see the emergence of political leadership among these women. And so Clara Lemlich is an immigrant, as are most of these workers. That most of the women in the garment industry are either immigrants themselves or the daughters of immigrants, and mostly from very low respect areas in the immigrant culture, that a lot of them are Jewish, a lot of them are Italian, which are considered sort of at the lowest rungs of immigrant communities. That also during the uprising of the 20,000, people like Clara Lemlich will be successful in gaining middle-class allies, people who will provide money and logistical support and that sort of thing to the movement. And so people like Ava Belmont, people like Anna Morgan will contribute funding, will also march in some of the pickets, will provide, and this is the sort of first step to that connection between the suffrage movement and this labor movement. That foundation is going to be solidified about a year later at the time of the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. The Triangle Shirtwaist Company is one of the largest garment manufacturers in the United States. They have a very large building. They control the top 3 floors of that building where they have their major plant facility. They are a huge employer. They had sort of led the movement to make concessions during the uprising of the 20,000. But they still have a workplace that is highly problematic. In 1911, a fire breaks out on the lower floor, the 8th floor of the production facility. That fire very quickly spreads from the suspicion is that somebody threw a cigarette into a trash can, and then the scraps of thread and fabric and lint and so on and so forth began to catch fire, and very quickly spread throughout the 8th floor up to the 9th floor, which was where most of the people were located. That it was at this time during the fire that we discovered some of the basic safety factors. Although Triangle was actually not one of the worst places to work in New York, it still was a dangerous place to work. And the company had padlocked all of the fire escapes, fearing that too many workers were taking unsanctioned breaks and going out to get a breath of fresh air and, talk to each other and that sort of thing. And they were afraid that they were losing productivity as a result of that. And so they figured the best way to stop this kind of problem was to simply prevent people from having any access to the fire escapes. There was only one elevator that went through the building. It was a freight elevator and was, first of all, very small, but was also not fireproofed. Although the building technically was a fireproof building, the elevator was not. It was not in an area that could contain fire. And so although some people were able to escape through the elevator, the fire actually blocked access for a lot of people to the elevator, and then the elevator stopped working. And so as a result of that, 146 people died in the Triangle Fire. The vast majority of them were women. And most of them either burnt to death because they couldn't escape, or basically broke through windows and deciding rather than burning to death, they would rather throw themselves on the pavement. And this was an extraordinarily gruesome event. It was in the middle of a Saturday afternoon. The building where the Triangle Company was located was right off Union Square, which is a big kind of middle-class center of New York at this time. And so people could first of all hear the screams and could hear the fire and explosions and that sort of thing, and then the fire trucks coming and so on. And so they ran down from Union Square and from the townhouses that surrounded Union Square and the businesses that surrounded Union Square, and then could see this horrific sight of, you know, people trying to be evacuated from the building and dying these horrendous deaths. And this really transformed sensibilities in New York. Remember that the garment industry workers were already fairly well organized because of the strike a year earlier. And so they had instantly were able to organize themselves. And this first photo that you see is them beginning to have mass marches in New York, up and down Fifth Avenue, through the neighborhoods in Greenwich Village, demanding for safety conditions and so on and so forth. We also see the emergence in the second photo of Rose Schneiderman. She had been a kind of middle-level important figure in the strike a year earlier, but really rose to prominence in the aftermath of the Triangle Fire. She began demanding that laws be changed. She demanded the prosecution of the owners of the plant. She began arguing for reorientation of the political system of New York. And she actually gained a number of allies. Robert Wagner, who was a politician from Tammany Hall, understands that these are legitimate complaints and begins shifting his career in Tammany Hall towards a greater level of protection for workers and more attention to safety conditions and that sort of thing. It also brings social workers into the political system. People like Frances Perkins, who actually was at a luncheon at a house on Union Square and sort of ran out to see this horrific event and decided that she needed to become politicized. And so we start seeing the realization of these women that it's not just about labor organizing, that they need to get the vote, that the way to have prevented the Triangle Fire was to have better safety regulations in New York. And the only way to do that would be by sending politicians to Albany and sending politicians to the Board of Aldermen in New York City, who would not only pass laws to make safer working conditions, but also then enforce those laws. And so we're starting to see this growing tie between the political process and the importance of women's suffrage in the labor movement. And NASA understands that these folks could be really important allies to them. And this seems to be the new face of women's suffrage, that it's not just about elite white women, it's also about poor working class women that are just trying to live better in the United States. Now, in 1913, so 2 years after the Triangle Fire, there's a concern at NASA that now is the time to get women's suffrage. Up until this point, the movement had been very oriented towards the Republican Party. Historically, the Republicans are much more willing to give women power than the Democrats had been. But in 1912, we see the election of a Democrat, Woodrow Wilson. And initially, in that period between his election and his inauguration, Wilson makes it clear that he's not terribly interested in giving women the right to vote. And if states want to do it, he can't stop that. But he has no interest in giving women nationally the right to vote. He just thinks that that's a bad idea. He's initially very anti-suffrage. And so basically, to put political pressure on him, NASA organizes on March the 3rd, which is the day before his inauguration day, a parallel demonstration in Washington, D.C. That will follow the parade route of the inauguration parade and is designed to demonstrate that women are here to stay and they expect the vote and they're a political force and you can't ignore us. This is going to be organized by NASA, and really the sort of architects of the movement are going to be these middle-class, white, kind of traditional backbone members of the suffrage movement. This is very much the symbolism of this is very kind of white and middle class. This is a drawing of Inez Mulholland, who leads the parade on a white horse, dressed, in these kind of, classical European, clothing that is meant to sort of harken back to the Magna Carta. There are other kind of women dressed up like Greek goddesses, and so the symbolism is very European, is very elite. It very much kind of tunes into the sort of historicism of the suffrage movement. The marchers will be organized by state for the most part. And so there will be an Illinois delegation, a New York delegation, and so on and so forth. The idea is that they will sort of take on a dress that is very similar to the kind of suffrage demonstrations that we've seen, which basically means either you dress in white or you dress in black. And it's going to be very reserved. It turns out that it's not, because there are a lot of anti-suffrage demonstrators along the parade route who attack the marchers and so on and so forth. And so it is going to be contested. That's important to remember. But also what I want to go back to is this idea of who gets to be a citizen. Because the basic kind of idea of how you're supposed to present yourself in this march is, even if you aren't a middle class white elite, you should look like one, you should dress like one. So there are labor leaders who participate in this, but they're dressed up nicely in their kind of nice clothing. They're sort of abiding by the basic kind of guidelines of how to look in this march. What kind of banners do you carry? Do you wear sashes? Yes, you do. That sort of thing. But the problem is it's okay for the labor leaders to do this, because it's really hard to say. Most women, when they're dressed in their sort of formal clothing, look kind of alike. This is, the joys of the American garment industry is that, the cloth might be better and the sewing quality might be better, but we all want to look the same. And so it's relatively easy for immigrants and lower class white people to sort of pass, at least in this parade venue. But it's very difficult for African American women. And so there's a real tension in this idea of the iconography of this march and the role of African American women in women's suffrage. There has been a very active African American women's suffrage movement in the United States. It is most successful in Washington, D.C., although it has also had significant success in northern cities like Chicago and New York City. It's had its least success in the Deep South. But increasingly what we see is the movement of women in the African American community to see themselves as a wedge to get African Americans all the right to vote. They do this through their established organizations. In this first photo, this is actually before the march. This was in 1910 at the Southern Baptist Convention, where an organization of African American women led by Nannie Helen Burroughs will argue not just for full citizenship for African Americans in the Baptist Church, so the right to preach, the right to attend seminary, that kind of thing, but also ultimately arguing for the right to vote, that the only way that you can secure the safety of the African American community is by giving African Americans the right to vote. And because the anti-vote effort in the South has been so deeply gendered, they believe that they have the opportunity, that a lot of the language about why you can't give African American men the right to vote is because if you give them the right to vote, they'll rape white women. And so that logic doesn't really hold up for African American women. And so they see this as a logical problem. And so as you can see here, they always, when they make their presentations, it's always dressed in a very kind of middle class, conventional manner, that they wear the same kinds of clothing that white middle class women would wear. They wear the same kind of hats, that sort of thing. But we see this spreading in the early 1910s to other organizations as well. The Delta Sigma Theta sorority is the first African American sorority in the United States. It was founded at Howard University. It was designed to do many of the same things that organizations like Burroughs were attempting to do, to sort of, create an equality and create a sense that middle-class African-American women should have the same status as middle-class white women. And so this sorority has been it's a service sorority, so they, do gifts to the poor. They do that sort of thing. And so they're very active in the community in Washington, D.C. And when the announcement is made by NASA that it's going to have this march preceding Woodrow Wilson's inauguration parade, they immediately suggest that they should march as a unit. They want to join the Washington, D.C. Delegation, so they want to march with the other women from Washington, D.C. And they're sort of politely told, well, no, you really can't do that. And other women are as well. Ida Wells Barnett tries to march with the Chicago delegation, and she's sort of politely told, well, you can't really, march with the Chicago delegation, but you can march. We're going to have an African-American delegation at the end of the parade, and you can march with them. And so she and the Deltas simply say, no, this is where we're going to march, and they sort of break into the line and sort of assert themselves. Because for them, it's more than just getting women the right to vote. They see it as a step to get all Americans the right to vote. That this is a way to expand the franchise and to roll back some of the constraints that have occurred against the African American community in particular, but also other groups as well. That what we see here is a movement that's far beyond what people like Susan B. Anthony had originally assumed. This is a movement that is really much more hearkening back to the original Seneca Falls movement that was just this abstraction about, everybody has the right to citizenship and that everyone has the right to have their own voice and that sort of thing. And so it sort of bypasses the conservatism of the suffrage movement that occurred immediately after the Civil War. And in fact, what we do see is a steady energy in women's suffrage, that the spokespersons, the public mental image of suffrage will continue to be women like Cat and like McCormick and like even Alice Paul, who's sort of on the radical end of the suffrage movement. And we do see this gradual, steady transition in several states. More and more of the state governments in the 1910s begin voting for women's suffrage. Finally, in 1917, New York State will grant women the right to vote. And so that's, New York State at that time was the most populous state in the United States. And so, in fact, by the time we get to 1919, most women have the right to vote through their state constitutions. And so can participate, but there still are these important exceptions, dominantly in the Deep South, where there still is an extraordinary intransigence. But what we do see is a real transformation of the movement and a real energy of the movement. That in May of 1919, so after World War I is over, the House of Representatives passes the text of what will become the 19th Amendment. In June, so a month later, the Senate will also pass the same language after some significant debate. And then the process goes to the ratification by the states. And a lot of the states that have already given women the right to vote will actually almost instantaneously grant it. In other states, it's actually a little more complicated. But finally, in August of 1920, we are celebrating the anniversary today. Finally, in August of 1920, Tennessee, which is the final state necessary, will ratify, and that means that the 19th Amendment will become American law. And this photo that you're looking at right now is actually Alice Paul, who is the head of the Women's Party of the United States. Every time a state ratifies, she sews a star onto this banner that she has for ratification. And then, you know, when the final state, when Tennessee finally ratifies, that banner will then be hung out in front of their national headquarters in Washington. And so you see this anticipation that actually in some respects goes pretty quickly. I hasten to point out that it's really hard to pass an amendment to the Constitution. Most amendments actually collapse. And this one seemed to be destined for the dustbin of history, but in fact is revived during the Wilson presidency. But then that has implications then for what happens next. Because remember, all of this is happening in this larger context of, do we want immigrants coming into this country? Do we want to naturalize immigrants? Do we want African Americans to vote? And so when most Americans are celebrating the passage of the 19th Amendment and its ratification, they have in their mind's eye this image of these middle-class white women who in many cases are college educated and certainly are refined and come from refined families and so on and so forth. But in fact, women in America are much more diverse than that. And so we suddenly see with the passage of the 19th Amendment a complication of exactly what does that mean. There are going to be significant logistical problems. Most states are very conservative by this time about how you get to be a voter, you know, how you actually get your name on the registration list. And one of the primary mechanisms that they use is how long have you lived where you live? How long have you lived in your precinct? And have you lived in that same address in that precinct? And so you have to go in and prove that you have lived there for a certain amount of time, which I want to point out, poor people are very mobile. It's hard for people to prove that they've lived the requisite number of months in a single residence simply because of the nature of their work. But also a lot of these states will be very limited in terms of, how long. In about half the states in the United States, you can't register for the November election by the time Tennessee has actually ratified the 19th Amendment. So you can vote in the next election, but you can't vote in 1920. And so that of women. Also, it's a cumbersome process. You have to prove that you're a citizen and all that. So you have to know what paperwork to bring and all that kind of thing. And in some states, they're fairly good at helping women navigate this process. And in other states, they're not quite so good. So we have to remember that that's a problem. So initially in 1920, women do not turn out in droves. But what we will see steadily through the 1920s is that transformation as more and more women come to voting. By the time we get to the 1928 election, women are voting at about, and registering to vote at about the same rates as men are. They're slightly behind, but the assumption is that they will catch up by the 1930s, given that trajectory. And so what we see is the real focus of what had been the suffrage movement shifting over to the voting rights movement. After the success of the 19th Amendment, the first thing that Carrie Chapman Catt does is form the League of Women Voters. And the idea is that this will be an organization that helps to create position papers about how to make democracy more effective. They're a nonpartisan organization, which is to this day a very strong element of it. But the idea is to spread the use of the vote and to make it as accessible as possible. And so they will create efforts to encourage women to register, but also to lobby state legislators to make the process easier. Actually, the League of Women Voters is very big on moving the venue for elections to more neutral areas. Some states historically had, made extensive use of things like bars and men's clubs and that sort of thing. Because if men are the only people who vote, well, then you can volunteer up your men's club office to do that. But they'll encourage state governments to move venues to things like public libraries and public schools. And they will advocate for this idea of making it easier for people to get to polling places, to know where the polling places are, that sort of thing. But also to make the process of registration more transparent. And so they will really lead a movement of get out the vote throughout the 1920s. They will be supported by other organizations like Collier's Magazine to encourage women to register to vote, but also then cast votes once they're registered. But once again, sort of going back to that 1913 march, really the iconography that they use is still this middle class iconography that harkens back to Greek and Roman democracy, that is very middle class and white centric. The one thing that they do change is increasing inclusion of children. And so we see in a lot of the posters, women taking their, presumably daughters into the voting booth and that sort of thing. And so it's a very particular kind of depiction of voting, and actually where we do see the most rapid increase of women voting and the most sort of aggressive participation in the political process is among middle-class white women. But it's also important to remember that other women sort of, take the bit and move on as well. This photo that you see here is a group of women. They're faculty at the Virginia Normal and Collegiate Institute, which is a historically Black college that does teacher training for women, but also does college prep, so that if you want to go on to a four-year university, they do. It's a junior college, essentially. And as faculty women, they decide that in Virginia, they should have the right to vote, that, the 19th Amendment gave them the right to vote. The Virginia legislature can no longer stand in their way. And so by golly, they're going to go down and register. And they are met with enormous resistance, but ultimately they are all successful. And they go down, they ultimately succeed because they go down in a group. They refuse to go individually. And they all cast ballots as soon as they can, and make it a point to sort of tell their students that this is an important process that educated African Americans have. That we also see other women's colleges and women's high schools doing very similar things, not without resistance. Mary McLeod Bethune, who is also an educator at this time, but in Florida, when she registers to vote, that evening, the Ku Klux Klan will appear in front of her house and threaten to burn her house down and kill her. And she decides that that's not going to stop her. And in fact, she does vote in the next election. But it's important to remember that there is going to be resistance, particularly for African-American women, but also for poor women across races. They will be impeded by problems of the basic rules of registration, things like poll taxes, things like literacy tests, that these things will continue to slow down the process of women. But ultimately, what we do see is an expansion of women's voting activity through the 1930s and then into the post-war period. So that's a sort of facet of the 19th Amendment that I think is often overlooked. And I hope you found it interesting, and I would be happy to try to answer any questions that I can.
I found this very interesting. So I appreciate you coming out. I was also, I loved to see all of the pictures. Like it helped me a lot. So
the 100th anniversary has been very fortunate to me because all of this stuff is suddenly they're pulling out. And
it's appearing, right? Yes. All over the place. So Teresa commented that she not so much has a question, just a comment about how discouraging it is that the same amount of struggle and prejudice seems to be relevant today. And I just wondered if you wanted to comment on that at all.
Yeah. That's actually one reason why I kind of went this route. We're all sort of struggling with what we think about what's happened in the last, several years. Mm-hmm. And citizenship to me, and I've actually, my scholarship originally was in diplomatic history, but a long time ago I switched, and really in the last 15 years, I've really worked very deeply with this idea of who gets to vote, who gets to pick the government, and right. who gets access to the government, and the rights, and just basic things like, can you go to the police and say, I need this person arrested because, I want you to file charges and this is my evidence, and that, we don't all have that right. Mm-hmm. And I know people hate serving on juries. I actually don't. I love serving on juries.
I desperately want to get chosen. They never pick me because my father was a police officer and I know a bunch of lawyers and nobody ever picks me.
Yeah. And, but it's such a privilege to live in a society where normal people get to decide what's right and what's wrong.
Right.
And, we need to cherish that. And we need to understand that people had to fight really hard. People died trying to get the vote. And absolutely. We need to hold on to that. And the same kinds of issues that we see springing up at the beginning of the 20th century, in fact, are all with us in varying degrees today. Immigration is still an issue today. Yeah. And class is still an issue today. And race is still an issue today. And these things just don't go away. But I think it is helpful to understand that it's not new. Mm-hmm. And I think sometimes, I don't think history repeats itself, but I think it rhymes. And it's useful to look back at what is the traditional narrative and what's the sort of subtext narrative. And that helps us better understand how we got to where we are today, but it also gives us some ideas about how we might negotiate the problems today.
I agree. I also was very interested in the sort of intersectionality aspects you talked about, especially at the beginning, because I've done so much reading on that currently, and it's still so incredibly true. So I like the notion that history doesn't repeat itself, but it certainly does rhyme quite a bit. Let's see what else is going on in chat. Lots of thank you. This was a fantastic presentation, excellent presentation. Thank you for making the connection to the present. Very interesting. Glad I got to participate. Loved the pictures too. So everyone loved you, and that sounds great. Does anyone have any more questions before we let Professor Miller get back to her day? Okay, excellent presentation. I've been working on the Library of Congress project to review and transcribe the correspondence of Alice Stone Blackwell. It's been very interesting.
Cool.
That sounds awesome.
Good job.
Right? What a great project to have. All right, we are at 1:10, so I think I need to let you go back to your day now. And thank you so much for participating and leading this for us. It was absolutely fascinating, and I know that according to chat, everyone just loved it. So thank you so much, Professor Miller.
Well, I was so happy that you invited me, and I'm glad you found it interesting. So thank you so much.
I'm sure we'll be in touch again.
And that would be fine. That would be
Great.
fine. And
Great.
Take care all.
Thank you so much, everyone. Remember, we are open. You are welcome to come in with masks on, and we look forward to seeing you at Clinton-Macomb Public Library. Thank you.